Beastcoast Pokemon, what is up? Today, James and I are here to discuss Zacian, one of the most powerful Pokemon ever created in the history of the game. The 2022 World Championships just wrapped up, and Zacian had a 67% usage rate among all competitors in day 2 of the tournament. And so, yeah, it's just one of the most used and most powerful Pokemon ever. And so, James and I are here just to, here to discuss about it. Hey guys, Cyber. Relax, I was just gonna get there. Anyway, as this little buddy was saying, 80% of you aren't subscribed to the channel, so hit that subscribe button. It really helps. Hey, what Pokemon are you? So, James, first of all, how are you doing?
Doing pretty well. We're talking about Zacian, and it's not as Xerneas, but it's pretty strong, getting that +1 attack off its ability, which makes it really powerful, of course. When it already has a base 170 attack stat immediately. It's already one of the fastest Pokemon as well, being 148 speed stat with the Rusted Sword, with its form change. It is absolutely incredible. And yeah, even if it doesn't have the ability to hold like an item, if you want that crown form, it's still a pretty strong mon, especially with its relatively very impressive bulk with 92 base HP and 115 in each of the defenses, as well as like really strong coverage as well. With Behemoth Blade, one of the strongest steel type moves, base 100, and it does double the damage to a Dynamax Pokemon, which is very important. Play Rough, which is of course really strong fairy coverage, close combat and Sacred Sword, and steel fighting and fairy combination, especially paired with like Ghost, for instance, which we saw on like the Edu team, for instance, with Calyx Shadow Rider. It's just such a strong combination. This Pokemon has a lot of tools.
Yeah, James just highlighted many reasons why Zacian was so powerful in Pokemon Sword and Shield, and ultimately, it also just has an incredible signature attack, right? Being able to do double damage to Dynamax Pokemon is incredible, and you would see Zacian use Behemoth Blade onto things that can resist it, like Charizard and Thundurus and Kyogre, and those Pokemon would still take so much damage from it. And so it was a combination of having, overall incredible stats, one of the highest base speeds in the game. Sword and Shield introduced some Pokemon that were really speedy, such as Zacian, Regieleki, and Calyrex Shadow Rider, and then also just incredible type coverage as well. You'd also occasionally see moves such as Swords Dance or Substitute used, and so this Pokemon really just had so many options. And so, the first question I have for you, James, you used Zacian. Do you think it was healthy for VGC and competitive Pokemon in general?
I wouldn't say healthy as a term, because this Pokemon does do so much damage and did need like quite a few answers, but overall I didn't think Zacian was nearly as bad in the format. With how Series 12 basically was formatted, where you have 2 restricted Pokemon, there's still a lot of Pokemon that could do relatively well against Zacian. Usually be able to at least eat up 1 Behemoth Blade and then be able to fire off a max move, usually being able to Oko Zacian. For instance, Groudon going for max Quake, Charizard with max Wildfire, and usually a lot of Kyogres being able to knock it out with max Geyser, for instance, was a pretty strong one right there. And also Zacian could not Dynamax as well, so that was one of the weaknesses. But overall, Zacian, you didn't really need to Dynamax it. However, yeah, it was pretty strong. Behemoth Blade, of course, doing so much damage, but I felt like Dynamax could really snowball, so being able to do a lot of damage to it is really impressive. And it also was a pretty important Pokemon for some certain Pokemon. I feel like Calyx Ice Rider could definitely be very overwhelming, I feel like, no matter what. So I feel like Zacian kind of helped out balancing out, because otherwise Calyx Ice Rider, I think, would have been pretty dominant in the format, especially with how strong that Pokemon is. So while I do think that Zacian was pretty strong, I don't think it was nearly as strong as like maybe these usage stats tell, because of course if we include with the day one, I don't think it was nearly as common, but it's still a very powerful Pokemon, and it just is a very consistent one, and you know what it does, and it just has so many good tools that it has access to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting comparing it to some of the other really dominant Pokemon in previous VGC formats, right? And so part of the question we're trying to answer here is Zacian the most OP Pokemon really ever in VGC history? And I think my answer here is really no, because you look at some other formats and there were some Pokemon that were just so centralizing. For example, Mega Kangaskhan in 2014 and 2015. Kangaskhan is actually a really interesting one, because it got countered so hard at the World Championships in 2014, where, it actually didn't win Worlds. Very few players actually even managed to make it into the top 16 with it. But it was still so powerful for almost the entire year. And to me, what was interesting about Zacian is that, there were actually a lot of Pokemon that can counter it decently. You just listed a couple. Zacian in itself just wasn't amazing into Incineroar, which was the number one most used Pokemon, just throughout the Series 12 metagame as well. And part of the other thing is you were allowed 2 big legendary restricted Pokemon, right? And so Zacian would often make up for one of the 2, but there was a lot of flexibility in what players would bring for, their duo. And there was, talking to a lot of players, right, Zacian felt like something that you could easily throw onto most teams and it would do its job. It would do a lot of damage, but it wasn't the number 1 threat, interestingly enough, because it wasn't actually able to Dynamax. And so I think, yeah, that's pretty interesting to look at in the context of previous VGC formats. So I'm curious, James, whether or not you think it's the most OP Pokemon, and if not, what is actually that?
No, I don't think it's nearly as strong, but I do think it is probably like a top 5 powerful Pokemon. Like, it really was pretty centralizing, and I think one of the big reasons mainly was because of Dynamax, because the ability just to do that much damage to a Pokemon through Dynamax, I think, was so incredible. And Zacian was just either OHKOing Pokemon through Dynamax or doing like at least 40% to a Dynamax Pokemon, which is 80% to a normal Pokemon, which is absolutely insane. And yeah, I think there are other Pokemon you did compare it to, like Mega Kangaskhan. I think mainly my examples would be Xerneas and Groudon. I do think Zacian is better than Xerneas. Xerneas was a very powerful Pokemon, but I think a lot of it came from its support Pokemon being able to help it set up Geomancy. You know basically what Xerneas did. When you play a Zacian, you pretty much know what to expect. You're always going to expect at least Behemoth Blade on the set at the very least. And Xerneas actually never ended up winning a world championship either, whenever it was legal in 2016 and 2019, falling in the top 4. But I do think that if I was to give a top ranked to a Pokemon, it would probably be Primal Groudon. I think Primal Groudon had very few counters, even just because of the fact that it was just really hard to deal with. Its damage output's pretty insane. It did win 2 out of 2 world championships that it was legal in. And I felt like Primal Groudon, it was just really hard to counter it because being able to be immune to water type attacks, of course, which is 4 times weakness, very few ground coverage out there that actually could like knock out Primal Groudon. And the fact that it does so much damage with its Fire Punch, Eruption, Precipice Blades, I think made it really hard to handle. And I feel like if it was legal in this format, it would give Zacian a very hard time as well. So I do feel like I would be more scared of like a Primal Groudon than I am a Zacian, but I feel like in this format specifically, it just felt like Zacian was just so oppressive, mainly because that Dynamax is really hard and you usually maybe have to come in a max move, and even Zacian could stall out with Substitute. But I do not think it was the most powerful Pokemon out there.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a fair take. And one thing that is also interesting to me was, of course, Series 12 in VGC allowed for 2 restricted, as we've talked about. But there was a format where you only had 1 restricted, right? That wasn't actually used for tournaments, but it was on the online ladder for a little bit before the official season kicked off. Now, in that format, in my experience, like, Zacian just felt overwhelmingly like the best Pokemon to use, which was kind of weird, to think about. But we didn't play that format for very long, but I was like, oh, if, this were the format that we'd play in Worlds, it feels like you're kind of throwing by not playing Zacian. But in the dual restricted format, there's so much flexibility. And, of course, yeah, Zacian was on a lot of teams, but there were a lot of teams in the, top 8, top 16 that also didn't have Zacian, right? The second place team from Worlds had Lunala and Groudon. Fourth place team from Worlds had Calyrex, Ice Rider, and Palkia. And so it wasn't like every team needed a Zacian, but it just fits so well into so many teams that, for a lot of players, it's just a really reliable option. And so, I think one of the big questions is, was Zacian maybe a little too overtuned in Sword and Shield, right? Like, was there any way to nerf it where players would still use it, but maybe not pick it as much? And for me, the answer is maybe just change its ability. Like, giving a free attack boost is just absolutely crazy because it already does so much damage. And something like Eternatus was interesting to me because it would still be used, although not very commonly, but, it still had a signature attack that would hit for a lot of damage. I get the idea behind giving it a free attack boost because Intimidate's obviously so common in VGC, whereas for special attackers, you don't have like a ability that can just easily, decrease the special attack stat immediately. But I'm curious if, you were to nerf Zacian, I mean, first of all, would you, and how would you do it?
I mean, I think it just depends. Mainly, I think what made Zacian, I think Zacian actually helped balance out Dynamax itself, how oppressive Dynamax could be and how easily you could snowball the ability to do that much damage to Thundurus and some other Dynamax Pokemon. I felt like what made Zacian like actually felt like a bit more fair. Yes, it was super strong, but I do think, I mean, it really just depends on the context, right? Because for instance, I feel like in series 10, when we had no Dynamax, for instance, even though Zacian could be like really strong, the problem was there were a bunch of Pokemon that could be able to use Fake Out, for instance, and stall out Zacian, and then Zacian wouldn't be able to accomplish nearly as much, which definitely gave some trouble. In fact, in that format, we did have that one invitational for like the world champions, basically, and the winner actually didn't even use Zacian. It was a Kyogre team that ended up winning. So I don't think it's a, I feel like nerfing it, I feel like the only way I would probably nerf it, I think it's attack stat, like getting the free attack boost. Yeah, it's a lot, but with how common Intimidate is, I don't mind it personally. I think maybe changing its base attack stat, or maybe just changing the power or the base power of Behemoth Blade, I think is probably the better one. Maybe Behemoth Blade should have been like 80 or 90 base power, or maybe it could have just been like 150 for its attack stat instead of like 170. But overall, I felt like for Dynamax format, which was series 12, which we played in, I felt like it was relatively like pretty, like it's still really powerful, but I didn't feel like it was like over the top necessary, unless it got a crit with Behemoth Blade. Like, you can't play around that. That's the only thing I like really did not like about Zacian, but otherwise I felt like it wasn't too hurtful throughout series 12, and I felt like it was actually a pretty good check to some other stuff like Calyx Ice Rider and some other Pokemon that could have definitely been troublesome. So I think it just really depends on the format and like what the rule set is.
Yeah, I think one really interesting point that you've brought up is, you know, how Zacian can be used to maybe cover other Pokemon that otherwise could be too overwhelming. I think anytime competitive players talk about, you know, metagames, right? Of course, like, there will often be Pokemon that are very centralized in the metagame. You know, Incineroar is so common on so many teams. But the thing is, if you were to get rid of those, like, top 2 or top 3 Pokemon, there often would just be something else that would fill that void, right? That would then also be super dominant. It's, especially in competitive VGC, often really hard, where, like, to have a format where, you know, everything is used at a, you know, consistent rate. Like, of course, some Pokemon are going to be picked more frequently than others. And I was talking to some other players and, you know, I asked them the same question of whether or not they thought Zacian was the most OP ever, and they were like, well, not really. It does remind us a little bit of Pokemon like Landorus T or Garchomp in previous formats, and even something like Incineroar, where it's really good, it's really consistent, but it's not, like, totally unbeatable or just, like, super oppressive. I think, yeah, like, when you mentioned Primal Groudon, like, just having access to a spread type attack, like, a hit both Pokemon for so much damage in itself is just, like, bonkers, right? But at least with Zacian, they did a good job, like, I would say, limiting its move pool so that it didn't get any crazy, like, spread type damage, and at least you do, okay, like, there are ways to beat it, which are Fake Out, there are ways to shut it down, but at the end of the day, I understand when, you know, players might still not love going up against it because they see a Zacian on, like, you know, the majority of teams, but the reality is, in a competitive game like VGC, yeah, like, you are always going to run into some Pokemon that are just used more frequently than others, right? And even if you were to ban the most common ones, there'd always be something to replace it. So last question and last discussion point here is just kind of your overall thoughts. I think you've already kind of highlighted that you think it's a fairly balanced Pokemon, and obviously, James, you've, you know, used it to very good success as well. But yeah, like, what do you think about Zacian overall?
Yeah, I think it just depends. Again, I'm basing it more on Series 12, which is the format we've all played mostly competitive, and I felt like overall it was a really strong Pokemon, no doubt about that. It really was oppressive to some teams and could just shut down a lot, and it's crazy how you just get the attack boost every time you switch in. But overall, I felt like it's really strong. It's really good. Is it game breaking? Probably not. That's a bit of a stretch. I think you would have needed a little bit more base power in the Behemoth Blade, or maybe a bit higher attack. But overall, I did think there were plenty of ways to shut down Zacian with Intimidate. I think what also, when we consider it, is like, how good are these Pokemon and by themselves compared to like partners? And I feel like Zacian, like, sure, it was really good on by its own, but I feel like a partner is also like just really complementing in general. For instance, I feel like Primal Groudon, sure, there are some partners you could just go along with and it will really help support the Groudon. But I feel like with Zacian, some of those partners could have been pretty valuable to how like it wanted to play. Like, it's getting a substitute, you might need like some Fake Outs support, and it really just depends, because I felt like Zacian alone wasn't really big of a problem. I think like it just was like paired with like really strong partners like Thunderous, for instance, on Eddie's World's Championship team. I think the ability to like scare out and intimidate with the definability on Thunderous could make it really terrifying. So I felt like Zacian alone wasn't really the big problem overall, but I do think it was a strong Pokemon in general.
Absolutely. I think so. To answer the question, is Zacian the most OP Pokemon in VGC history? James and I would both say no, but we definitely rank it up there. Of course, it was used so commonly, right? Like, once again, when you look at the usage statistics from Worlds, that is a very, very high number. That's higher than most Pokemon I can imagine at other World Championships, but I wouldn't say it was, like, the most dominating member. At the end of the day, there are a lot of players that don't really love the restricted formats, right? Because they do become more centralized. Of course, they revolve around these really powerful legendary Pokemon. But to me, in Sword and Shield, at least this restricted format that allowed for 2 restricteds was actually a little bit more open and diverse than some of the others, like 2016, where you literally only had 4 Pokemon being used at a high level generally, which were the Primals, Mega Rayquaza, and then Xerneas, right? And so it's like, I think the top 16 teams at Worlds, every team featured a combination of 2 of those 4, whereas at least in Series 12 and in Sword and Shield, there was a lot more diversity. And even at Worlds, you'd see a lot of the same restricteds, but at least they'd be, used like interchangeably a little bit more. And so, yeah, those are our thoughts on Zacian here. So let us know whether or not you think Zacian was the most OP Pokemon in Pokemon history and in VGC history specifically, what you thought about Zacian overall, how you would nerf it, and whether or not you like the Pokemon in general. So thank you so much for watching, and yeah, until next time.